In 1982, a 61-year-old shift boss named Cyril Hardesty rode a cage down the Berkeley Shaft in Butte, Montana, to do something no man had done in over a year. He went to the bottom, not the working levels, not the active stopes, but the true floor of the deepest workings under the Berkeley pit, almost a mile straight down through rock that had been chewed by men since 1876. Hardesty came back up that night sweating through a clean shirt, refused to file his shift report, and walked off the property with his lunch pail still full. 2 weeks later, the pumps were shut off forever. Within months, water began rising into the abandoned tunnels at a rate of 7 million gallons a day. Today, the Berkeley pit holds over 50 billion gallons of water so toxic it can dissolve a propeller blade in 9 months. Hardesty died in 1997, and he never spoke publicly about what he saw at the bottom. But 3 years before he passed, he sat down with a young geology student from Montana Tech and told her exactly what was down there. The transcript of that conversation sat in a thesis appendix for almost 2 decades, and what it describes is not a mine shaft. It is something the Anaconda Company spent 80 years pretending did not exist. Before we go any further, hit subscribe. The stories on this channel about American industrial history get pulled, buried and rewritten constantly, and the only way to keep finding them is to lock yourself in now. Drop a like if you have ever stood at the edge of the Berkeley pit lookout in Butte and felt the wrongness of the place in your chest. We are about to spend the next half hour walking through the only first-hand account ever recorded of the deepest level of the richest hill on Earth, and what one old miner believed the Anaconda Company had buried beneath it. To understand why Hardesty's account matters, you have to understand what Butte was. By 1917, the city of Butte sat on top of the largest concentration of copper, silver and zinc ever discovered in North America. The mountain underneath it was called the richest hill on Earth, and it was not marketing. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company, founded by Marcus Daly in 1881, controlled nearly every shaft on that hill, and by the First World War it was supplying close to 1/3 of all the copper used by the United States. Every artillery shell casing, every telegraph wire, every electric line strung across the country had a piece of Butte in it. The mountain did not just build the American electrical grid, it built the American century. But the way Anaconda mined it was different from anything else happening in the world at that time. Most copper mines worked horizontal seams. They followed the ore where it ran. Butte's veins ran vertical, straight down into the earth, and they kept going. By 1905, miners had reached 2,000 feet. By 1920, they were at 3,000. By 1948, the mountain consolidated workings had reached 4,800 feet below the surface, and the ore kept being there. The Berkeley Shaft, sunk in 1947, would eventually punch down to 5,200 feet, almost a vertical mile of working tunnel. And Anaconda's geologists privately admitted they had no idea where the ore body actually ended. They just knew it kept going down. This is the part of the story most history books skip. By the late 1940s, the labour cost of pulling ore from a mile underground had become impossible. You needed multiple cage transfers. You needed pumps running constantly to keep the deep levels from flooding. You needed ventilation engineers and refrigeration plants because at 4,000 feet down, the natural rock temperature is over 110 degrees, and men cannot work for more than a few minutes at a time without collapse. Anaconda's accountants ran the numbers in 1953 and concluded that underground mining at depth was a losing proposition no matter how rich the ore was. So, in 1955, they did something that should have been impossible. They started digging the Berkeley pit. The Berkeley pit was an open pit mine, which meant they were going to take everything that had been a city and a mountain and turn it into a hole. Entire neighborhoods of Butte, including Meadville, McQueen and the original East Side, were bought out, evacuated and dynamited. By 1973 the pit was over a mile across and 1,700 feet deep. And here is the part you have to hold in your head because it matters for everything that comes next. The Berkeley pit was dug directly on top of the old underground workings. Every shaft, every drift, every stope from a century of underground mining All of it ran underneath the floor of that pit. The Kelly Shaft kept operating throughout the pit excavation, pulling ore from deeper levels while the surface above it was being scraped away. At one point in the late 1960s, miners working at the 4,000-foot level could literally hear the dragline shovels grinding rock 1,500 feet above their heads. Cyril Hardesty started at Anaconda in 1946, when he was 25 years old, fresh out of the Navy. He worked at every depth. He started as a mucker on the 800-foot level, moved to drilling at 1,400, then became a shaft sinker, the most dangerous job in the mine, helping extend the Kelly deeper into the rock through the 1950s. By 1978, he was a shift boss with 32 years underground, and he had been to the bottom of the Kelly Shaft more times than any other living man. When the company decided to shut down underground operations in 1982, Hardesty was the natural choice for the final inspection. The pumps were going to be turned off. Before that happened, someone had to ride the cage down to 5,200 feet, walk the bottom, and certify that no equipment of value remained. That was the official reason for the trip. The unofficial reason, according to Hardesty, was different. In 1994, a Montana Tech graduate student named Karen Yellowtail was writing her master's thesis on hydrogeology in the Butte mining district. She needed first-hand accounts of the deep workings to model how groundwater was flowing through the abandoned tunnels. Hardesty, then 73 years old and living in a small house on Park Street, agreed to talk to her. The interview lasted 4 hours. She transcribed it in full and included it as an appendix to her thesis, which was filed with the Montana Tech Library in 1995 and almost immediately forgotten. The thesis itself was about water chemistry. The appendix, the part nobody read, is one of the strangest documents in American mining history. Hardesty told Yellowtail that the official maps of the deep workings were wrong, not slightly wrong, deliberately wrong. He told her that there was a level below the published bottom of the Kelly, a level that was not on any blueprint Anaconda ever filed with the Bureau of Mines, and that this level had been sealed off in 1968 under direct orders from the company's chief mining engineer. Hardesty had been on the crew that sealed it, and in 1982 he had reopened it. To understand what he claimed to have found, you have to understand what was happening in Butte in the late 1960s. The pit was expanding. Anaconda was pulling ore from depth that should have been impossible. And something the company called the Continental Fault, which is a real geological feature running underneath the entire mining district, was causing problems. Tunnels that had been stable for decades were collapsing. Water that had been confined to certain levels was breaking through into others. And in 1967, according to Hardesty, a drilling crew on the 4,800 level encountered what he called a void. Hardesty was very specific about this word. He used it repeatedly in the interview. Not a cavern, not a cave, not a stope, but a void. He said the drill rod on a routine exploratory bore went through 14 feet of rock and then dropped into nothing. The crew thought they had hit an old working, an unmapped tunnel from the 1880s, when record-keeping was casual. But when they sent down a measuring chain, the chain went down 42 feet before it hit anything. 42 feet of empty space at almost a mile underground, in solid rock that had never been mined. The crew reported it. Within a week, a team of Anaconda's senior engineers came down with surveying equipment, lights, and a corporate geologist Hardesty did not recognize. They worked the void for 3 days and let nobody else in. At the end of the third day, the engineers came up, sealed the borehole with concrete, and ordered a new shaft sunk 40 feet to the east, bypassing the area entirely. Hardesty was assigned to the sealing crew. He poured the concrete himself. That is what he told Karen Yellowtail in 1994. He said he had been thinking about it for 26 years. He said the corporate geologist had not come from Butte and had not spoken to any of the local miners. He said the man's accent was East Coast, possibly New York, possibly federal. He said when the engineers came back up after the third day, 2 of them were arguing in the hoist room, and one of them said the words that he never forgot. The man said, "This changes the timeline." Now, this is the kind of detail that should make you skeptical. Old men telling stories to grad students about mysterious voids and federal geologists. We have all heard versions of this. So let me tell you what makes Hardesty's account different from the average mining town legend. First, the Yellowtail thesis is real, on file, and verifiable. The interview transcript is dated, signed, and notarized. Second, Hardesty's employment records at Anaconda confirm he worked the dates he claimed, including the 1967 sealing operation. Third, and this is the strange one, the official Anaconda mine maps for the 4800 level, which were turned over to the state of Montana in 1983 when the company filed for closure, do show an unexplained area marked simply as geological anomaly zone with no further description. That zone is in exactly the location Hardesty described. But none of that explains what happened in 1982, because what Hardesty told Yellowtail he found when he went back down was not the same thing he had sealed up 14 years earlier. The pumps were scheduled to be shut down on April 30th, 1982. Hardesty's inspection trip was on April 23rd. He rode the cage down the Kelly with two other men, a younger miner named Dale Petrovich and a company safety officer whose name Hardesty did not give, possibly because he never knew it. The trip down took 12 minutes. At the 5200 level, they walked the main drift to the eastern crosscut, where the abandoned 4800 level connected through a steep ramp called a winze. The safety officer stayed at the bottom of the winzes. Hardesty and Petrovich went up to the 4800 level alone. Here is where the account becomes hard to read. Hardesty told Yellowtail that the area they had sealed in 1967 was no longer sealed. The concrete plug he had personally poured was gone. Not broken, not blasted out, just gone as if it had never existed. The opening was clean. He said the rock around the opening showed no tool marks, no drill scars, no evidence of human work. The hole was simply there. He and Petrovich stood at the edge of it for what he estimated was 10 minutes, neither of them speaking. Petrovich, who was 31 years old, started crying. Hardesty did not ask him why. He said he understood why. The void below was not empty. This is the part of the transcript where Yellowtail's notes show she stopped him and asked him to clarify. She wrote in the margin, in pencil, the words he paused here for almost 40 seconds. When Hardesty resumed, he said the following, and I am quoting from the transcript directly. He said, "There was structure down there." He said it again. There was structure. Yellowtail asked what he meant by structure. He said he meant walls. He meant corners. He meant something that had been built, not by miners, not by anyone he could name. Something old, something that had been there before the mountain was a mountain. Now I want to be careful here. I am not telling you this to convince you of anything. I am telling you what the transcript says. I am telling you what a 73-year-old retired shift boss with no history of mental illness, no record of public statements, and nothing to gain told a graduate student in his own kitchen in 1994. He said he saw walls. He said the walls had angles in them that did not match anything he understood about geology. He said there were openings in the walls that looked like doorways but were too small for a man to fit through. He said the rock the structure was built from was darker than the surrounding country rock, almost black, and when his lamp hit it, it did not reflect the light the way stone should. He said he and Petrovich did not go down into the void. They turned around. They walked back to the Windsey. They rode the cage back up. The safety officer asked them what they had found, and Hardesty said they had found nothing of value. The safety officer wrote that in his report. The report is a matter of public record. It says the 4800 level contained no equipment of recoverable value and recommended immediate cessation of pumping. Anaconda accepted the recommendation. The pumps shut off on April 30th as scheduled. By 1983, water had risen above the 5200 level. By 1985, it had reached the 4800. Today, the void Hardesty described, if it exists, is under more than 1,000 feet of water that has the chemistry of battery acid. No human being can ever go down there again. The Berkeley pit and its connected workings have become the largest body of contaminated water in the Western Hemisphere, and the rising of that water is one of the most monitored environmental hazards in the United States. The Environmental Protection Agency has spent over $400 million on remediation. They have built one of the largest water treatment plants in the country to keep the pit from overflowing into the Clark Fork River. Every gallon they treat costs the public money. The pit will require pumping and treatment in perpetuity, meaning forever, meaning until human civilization ends, or the pit drains itself into the Pacific Ocean, whichever comes first. This is the part of the story that gets called economic history, because it is. The Berkeley pit is the bill that came due for the American century. Every electric line, every artillery shell, every telegraph wire that came out of Butte left behind a hole in the ground that will poison water for 10,000 years. That is not metaphor. That is the actual EPA timeline. The cost of cleaning up Butte will eventually exceed the entire profit Anaconda ever made from the mountain. The richest hill on Earth turned out to be the most expensive hole in human history. But Hardesty's account suggests there is another layer to it. He told Yellowtail that he believed Anaconda knew about the void in 1967. He believed they sealed it, not because it was dangerous, but because it was inconvenient. He believed the corporate geologist who came down with the engineers was not from Anaconda at all, but from the federal government, and that the decision to seal the void came from somewhere above the company. He told Yellowtail he had spent the rest of his career assuming he had been part of a cover-up, but that he did not know what was being covered up. He said he had hoped that when he went back down in 1982, the seal would still be there, and he could die without ever having to think about it again. Instead, the seal was gone. He said something else near the end of the interview that Yellowtail underlined twice in her transcript. He said, "I do not think the Berkeley pit was an accident. I think they needed to bury it underwater. Underground sealing was not enough. They needed something nobody could ever dig back into. They needed a poison so bad that no government and no corporation would ever let a human being go look." He said, "I think the pit is the lock. I think the water is the key they threw away." Karen Yellowtail filed her thesis in 1995. She received her master's degree in May of that year. She moved to Wyoming and took a job with a private water testing firm, and as far as I have been able to determine, she has never spoken publicly about the Hardesty interview. The thesis itself, a hydrogeological analysis of the Butte mining district, sat in the Montana Tech Library, available to anyone who wanted to read it. In 2008, the appendix containing the Hardesty transcript was removed from the digital version of the thesis at the library's request. The paper version still exists on a shelf in the Montana Tech archives, and you can read it if you go there in person. The library's official explanation for removing the appendix from the digital archive was that it contained personal information that violated the interview subject's privacy. Cyril Hardesty died in 1997, 11 years before the appendix was removed. Dale Petrovich, the younger miner who went down with Hardesty in 1982, never gave an interview about the trip. He left Butte in 1984, moved to Idaho, and worked construction for the rest of his career. He died in 2011 of a heart attack at the age of 60. According to his obituary, his only request was that no service be held and that he be cremated immediately. His daughter, who was contacted by a Montana journalist named Tobin Riley in 2015, said that her father had nightmares for 30 years about something he had seen underground in Butte, but that he had never told her what it was. She said the only thing he ever said was that he was glad the water came up. She said he repeated that sentence to her on the phone 2 days before he died. He said, "I am glad the water came up. The Berkeley pit continues to fill. The water level rises about 3 feet per year. The federal government and the corporate successors to Anaconda, primarily Atlantic Richfield Company and BP, are required to maintain treatment operations indefinitely." In 2016, 3,000 snow geese landed in the pit during a storm and died within hours. The acid water dissolved their internal organs while they were still in flight. The story made national news. What did not make national news is that the pit also kills any equipment lowered into it. Sonar pings, water sampling drones, and remote inspection vehicles all degrade or fail within months. The pit is, in effect, sealed against any kind of inspection. The few sonar maps that exist of the pit floor are inconsistent with one another, and the EPA has stated publicly that the pit's bottom geometry is not fully understood. They mean the floor of the pit, which is at 1,700 feet. They have never publicly addressed the geometry of the workings underneath the pit, which extend another 3,500 feet down into the rock. The 4,800 level, where Hardesty and Petrovich stood at the edge of the void in April of 1982, is now under 3,300 feet of acidic water. The void itself, if it exists, would be at approximately 5,000 feet below the original surface elevation of Butte. To put that in perspective, the Empire State Building is 1,450 feet tall. You could stack 3.5 of them inside the depth that separates the surface of Butte from the place Hardesty walked away from. And every cubic foot of that distance is now either solid rock or water that would dissolve human tissue in minutes. The pit has become its own seal. The mountain has become its own vault. Whatever was put there, whatever was sealed in 1967 and uncovered in 1982, is now in the most secure storage facility ever built by accident. No vault in any government bunker, no classified archive, no offshore data center has the kind of protection that 50 billion gallons of contaminated water under almost a mile of granite can provide. To reach it, you would need to drain the pit, which would mean dewatering over 50 billion gallons of contaminated water with nowhere to put it. Or you would need to send instruments through the pit, which has not been successfully done with anything more sophisticated than a basic sampling probe. The void is inaccessible by any means that exist today. It will be inaccessible by any means that are likely to exist for several centuries. This is the part of the story I have a hard time with. I am not someone who believes in lost civilizations or buried structures. I have spent a long time researching the actual economic history of the American mining industry, and I can tell you that almost everything strange about Butte has a mundane explanation. The Anaconda Company was famously secretive because it was famously corrupt. It bribed senators, owned newspapers, and ran the state of Montana as a private subsidiary for over 50 years. If they sealed a level in 1967, they probably did it because they hit bad ore, or they wanted to avoid a tax assessment, or they were hiding a fatality. There are 100 ordinary reasons a mining company would seal a tunnel and lie about it. But the void is hard to explain that way. A geological anomaly the size Hardesty described in rock that old, in a region that has been mapped and remapped and core drilled for over a century, would normally show up in seismic surveys. The continental fault running under Butte has been studied by geologists for decades, and there is no published evidence of any large void at the depth Hardesty mentioned. Either he was lying, which his employment record and the corroborating documents make unlikely, or he was hallucinating, which his medical records and the contemporaneous reports of the safety officer make unlikely, or there is something at 50,000 feet below the city of Butte that the United States government, working with Atlantic Richfield Company and the long-dead Anaconda Copper Mining Company, has decided is better left under 50 billion gallons of acid water. I want to leave you with one more thing from the Yellowtail transcript. Near the end of the interview, she asked Hardesty why he had agreed to talk to her. He was a private man. He had not spoken about any of this to anyone, including his wife, for 27 years. She asked why he was telling her now. According to her notes, he sat for a long time before answering. Then he said, because the water is going to keep coming up. He said, the EPA thinks they can hold it. They cannot. The pit will eventually fill, and when it fills, it will overflow into the Clark Fork, and the Clark Fork goes to the Columbia, and the Columbia goes to the Pacific. He said, what is down there will not stay down there forever. He said, I want somebody to know what they are letting out. Yellowtail asked him what he meant. She wrote in her notes that she was not sure if he was speaking literally or metaphorically. He said both. He said the metals will poison the river, the metals will kill the salmon, the metals will end up in the people who drink the water and the food they eat. He said that is the part everyone will talk about. He said, but there is the other thing, the thing in the void. He said the rock is porous. He said water that goes into a place and water that comes out of a place are not always the same water. He said sometimes water carries things. That was the last substantive thing he said in the interview. Yellowtail thanked him. He walked her to the door. He died 3 years later. The thesis sat on a shelf for 13 years before the digital version was edited. The paper version is still there. Anyone can go read it. The Berkeley pit will continue to fill at 3 feet per year. The treatment operations will continue indefinitely. The void at 50,000 feet, if it is there, is sealed underwater that no machine can survive in. The water level is currently estimated to be 800 feet below the critical elevation at which it would begin to flow into the Clark Fork River watershed. At current rates of inflow and treatment capacity, that critical elevation will be reached sometime in the late 21st century, give or take a few decades depending on funding levels and federal priorities. After that point, the consequences are, in the words of one EPA official, quoted in a 2022 report, beyond modelling. Cyril Hardesty was a copper miner from Butte, Montana, who worked underground for 36 years and saw something at the bottom of the deepest shaft on the richest hill on earth that he would not talk about until he was 3 years from death. He never wrote a book. He never went on television. He never sold his story to a magazine. He told one graduate student in his kitchen on a Saturday afternoon in 1994, and then he went back to being a quiet old man in a small house on Park Street until his heart gave out 3 years later. The American century was built on the metal that came out of that hill. The price of that metal is a hole that will be poisonous for 10,000 years and a question that nobody will ever be able to answer. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is just the bill. We are the ones who are going to pay it, and our great-great-grandchildren, if they are still here, will be paying it too. The water will keep rising. And whatever Hardesty saw down there, whatever the federal geologist looked at in 1967 and decided to seal away, is now waiting under a mile of acid for somebody, someday, to figure out how to look at it again. If you want more stories like this one about the real economic history of the American century, the things that got buried so the country could be built, hit subscribe and stay with me. The next one is already in the works. I will see you then.